All right, so this is the week 2 recap video. And again, I know a number of you had said you were having some troubles with the readings and weren't sure, but based on the discussion posts, quite a few, I think, of you are getting some of the basic points as well. So in week 2, we looked at the ancient Irish. So some of the first people to inhabit this land before it became Christian, before it was ruled over by other civilizations. And so you had these indigenous people at first, and the Celts came. Celts were an ancient group that roamed Europe, and at least a part of them, a portion of their group, traveled to Ireland. We find out that these were very bold people. These were people that lived for the day. These were people that were somewhat wild. They were very sexually open. You know, they would sleep around and sleep with many people and not think much of it. These were people that were willing to fight and willing to die and willing to think big. They loved big imaginative stories. They would exaggerate in terms of how they viewed the world. And most of you looked at that Queen Medb, and Queen Medb was a really kind of fascinating woman. So her husband, the story goes that Cahill tells of her husband and her. They're kind of in bed, they're talking, and he says, "Oh man, aren't you lucky you married me? You're a lucky girl." She says, "What? Kind of screw you. I was well off before I met you, before I married you." And then they have a contest, see who has the most possessions. And Medb ultimately loses, but she's willing to kind of steal, kill, sleep with somebody else to get kind of the more possessions. So she's not someone who's going to back down, and quite a few of you, most of you, perhaps all of you, really admired this about her, that she was bold, that she was willing to stand up for herself, that she was willing to go out and do what needed to get done to get her way. And what's interesting here as well is the question of whether she was kind of an ancient feminist, in the sense that she was doing things that the feminist movement allowed women to do much later on. And in that regard, it's a question of whether she was breaking gender ideals and gender norms. And it's not clear that she was. And what I mean by that is that in that ancient Irish world, women weren't necessarily viewed as second rates, weren't necessarily viewed as weaker, weren't necessarily viewed as subservient, as there to obey, as there to simply take care of immediate family needs. It may certainly be the case that many women in that period were viewed as kind of as equals, almost, maybe not quite, but certainly almost equals, and they were allowed to do many more things. And it may not be that the women, the ancient Celtic Irish women, were doing this because they rejected other societies that kept their women in place. It may be that they didn't simply know any better. That gender roles, that this is what it means to be a man and this is what it means to be a woman, weren't necessarily in place at that time. And perhaps that's really kind of fascinating, because we're in an era now where what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman is changing, and it's much more fluid. I was talking to two of your teammates a few days ago, and essentially saying, look, my grandmother, when I asked her to buy some raffle tickets, sell your raffle tickets, said, I was like, do you want to buy some tickets for the team? She said, I don't like girls playing rugby. And it's not traditionally a female sport. This is not something you're supposed to do as a woman. And today, this is more accepted. These boundaries, these identities are breaking down. So maybe, just maybe, we're getting back to a time frame more like the ancient Irish. And that's pretty fascinating to think about. Okay. In terms of the other aspect of the readings, so Sam Greenlaw, I got to give a shout out to her. She was the only one to directly answer this question of why it is the case that the Irish St. Augustine is so concerned with trying to make miracles and explain how miracles are compatible, work together with natural processes. In other words, he's really trying to focus and to explain and to argue that miracles don't contradict the laws of nature. They're not something utterly different than the laws of nature. And this is really important to him because he wants to distinguish Christianity from the pagan views of the populace at that time. He wanted to say that Christianity is offering something different than the pagan, which means kind of just the secular, the non-religious culture of that day. And the reason that he was doing this with miracles is because the pagans believed in magic, and they believed in magicians. That some people, not magicians like kind of going to a kid's party, but magicians in the sense that there's certain people who could control nature, at least in certain ways. Certain people could make it rain, for example. Certain people could put curses on you, turn nature against you. So there's certain people who had the power to disrupt nature, to control it, to bend it to their will. And what the Irish Augustine is simply saying is that no, nature is made by an all-good, all-loving, orderly, rational God. So God is not going to allow, somebody who to kind of change the laws of nature, to violate the laws of nature, just because it suits their will. But then he's got a problem, because miracles seem to do just that. It seems like in miracles, the laws of nature are suspended, violated, set aside, because either, a holy person is bending nature to their will, or maybe just because God is choosing to kind of disregard the laws of nature. And in that case, there are no kind of stable set laws. There's kind of rules and order as long as God doesn't intervene directly and change them. So he wants to show how all the miracles in the biblical stories actually are compatible, actually work with these laws of nature. And I'm not going to go into that because you guys did a decent job of that in discussion board posts. But he talks about the virgin birth. He talks about the great flood. He talks about turning water or pulling water from a rock. He talks about sending food from heaven. He talks about Aaron changing his rod into a serpent. He talks about the plagues turning the river bloody. And so all that stuff, he's going to say, look, even just by the normal operations of nature, we could understand how this is possible. It may speed up the laws of nature. It may use certain reverse laws of nature, reverse processes within nature, but not violate, not change it. For the virgin birth, for example, he says, look, there's certainly species within nature that reproduce asexually. So perhaps God allowed that natural event to occur with Mary. And I know some of you disagree with that, Kim Kasnick. I got to give a shout out to you in terms of really questioning that as well. The BBC documentary. So I'll kind of end with that. You guys are right to note that certainly it shows that Ireland has this multicultural aspect, that there's different people in the world coming to Ireland, that actually Ireland wasn't all that isolated in ancient times, because water wasn't a barrier for the ancients. In fact, traveling over land was oftentimes much harder, because there were no roads, there were mountains, things like that. There were dangers. Whereas sea, it's kind of more wide open. So the BBC documentary makes that point, that there's many different cultures, many different peoples interacting. And we see that as well, and quite a few of you mentioned that with the artifacts, these ancient artifacts found that came from other parts of Europe. Many people notice as well that they talked about the Irish being uncivilized, on the edge of civilization, forgotten about. And you said that was similar to Cahill and Duty. But I want to talk about something that very few of you, if any of you, noticed, and that was the narrator questioning whether Ireland was always so beat up, always so captive, always so invaded. And he says, look, in ancient times, the Irish were very fierce. In fact, they intimidated uh, certain groups. Julius Caesar decided not to go to Ireland, not to try to conquer it, because it is on the edge of civilization. It is wild. It is kind of a hellish place. So there is this kind of intimidation. They weren't just these weak people. They weren't these people that were always held captive, always put down, always impoverished, always oppressed. In fact, the narrator mentions in these ancient times, sometimes the Irish, the people from Ireland, were the ones doing the raiding, were the ones taking captives, taking slaves. So, not to deny that there is a deep history of oppression, not to deny that the Irish people have abused, not to deny that the Irish people have been degraded and looked down upon and seen as subhuman. But the narrator also wants to say, in these ancient times, they weren't necessarily as oppressed as maybe the more modern day Irish are. Okay, so I hope that helps clear up the ancient reading, and we move now on to St. Patrick, the greatest Irish saint, and one of the most recognizable figures in the world.